Tyler McNabb, do Buddhists believe in the Christian God?
I'll give you one better. Not only do some of them believe in the Christian God, they worship the Christian God.
Okay, I think our viewers and listeners are going to want you to justify that wild claim you've just made, but maybe we can just back up a little bit and get to sort of your understanding of what the Christian God is. So Tyler, you're a classical theist, which is, among other things, the official view of the Catholic Church. So it's not a kind of really weird, unusual view of God. But I do think actually it conflicts a little bit with how many people think about the Christian God. I find just talking to people have this idea that the Christian God is kind of like this big mind. You know, people use the phrase, the old guy in the sky, you know, this big old bearded chap who's tutting at us all the time or something. And that the classical theist God is very different to that, right? So could you start off just telling us a little bit about classical theism?
Yeah, so when I talk to a lot of my atheist colleagues and we're talking about God, one of the first things I have to do, right, when I'm trying to persuade them that actually my view is not so crazy, is I have to say, well, that's not what I actually believe, right? Like I don't believe that there is this super mind in the sky who's just like you and I, made up of various properties, and kind of maybe he goes in and out of time, and thinks in the way we do and responds in the same sort of ways in which we do, and reflects in the same ways we do. That's not what I mean by God. And so when I consider God, I don't consider him to be, as St. Bonaventure would say, another being amongst other beings.
Right.
So God is not just like an object. Rather, he is what makes objects possible, right?
Right.
So even in the sort of tradition that I like to emphasize, kind of this Neoplatonic / what some people will call like Blackfriar Thomism or grammatical Thomism, this idea that God is no thing, right? It sounds kind of a little provocative, right? God is no thing, nothing, right?
Right.
But the idea is that if you are a thing and you're trying to make sense of all things, then you have to like include yourself, and then you have some like circularity concerns and stuff. So if we're going to try to ground all things, we can't then appeal to a member of the things to ground all things. At least that's how one of the worries generally is articulated. And so we need to go beyond thinghood. And when you start looking into the Tao Te Ching and you start looking into various Buddhist philosophers like Del Popa or Shenron, you start looking into Advaita Vedanta with Shankara, all of a sudden I think I start seeing a lot of convergence occurring and how they're talking about ultimate reality, how they're talking about the kind of the ineffable one, so to speak.
Right.
And so on my view, God is simple. It's not made up of properties. He's immutable. He's impassible. He doesn't change. We can't cause change in him. And ultimately, the idea is that he's not simply another being like you and I. He's not a person, at least in the same way you and I are persons.
Right.
He's totally other, and our language about him at best is analogical, is by way of analogy.
Right.
And even those analogies, though, there's more dissimilarities than similarities within them. And so, anyway, when I say God, I mean the ground of all being. I mean the sheer act of existence itself.
That's really helpful. So I'm getting a sense from you that God is radically other, completely different in every way from anything in the physical universe, from anything in creation. You used the word there, ineffable, which means, I guess, beyond description, beyond what you can capture in language. So how does that fit then with, isn't God supposed to be all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly good, personal in some sense? And I suppose, this might come to where there's supposed to be the conflict with what Buddhists or Hindu mystics believe. We could get to that. But so how do you reconcile this idea of God being radically other completely different to us, with God being all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly good. This seems sort of conflicting on the face of it.
Right. So here is where I'd want to emphasize that God, when we speak about him, again, is through imperfect analogies. And so when I say that God is all-knowing, when I say that God is all-powerful, when I say that he's all good, I don't mean that he's good in the same way that we are good. So, for example, you might judge another human being as like a creature who obeys God, and we can judge the creature whether or not they're fulfilling their duties that God gives them, right?
Right.
We can say that they're morally good in the same way that the creature is morally good in the same way that other creatures are morally good. But when it comes to God, God is supposed to be like the grounding goodness itself, right? The Platonic form of goodness, right? And that's like, are we going to say, is there some other form in which we judge the Platonic form of goodness by? And it's like, no. There's no one to give God duties, so to speak. And obviously, if you think God's not a person or an object like you and I are, then he's not going to even have those duties. So whenever we talk about God being good, whenever we talk about God being powerful or knowledgeable, these again are analogies that were given to God that we're asserting. It's not. The idea is not that God has knowledge in the same way that you and I have knowledge. Maybe God's knowledge is non-propositional. Maybe God's power isn't in reference to like the force that I can bring up and raise and make and that sort of thing with my two hands. Maybe we should understand this more analogically.
So let's focus on knowledge maybe, because knowledge seems to be the one that's most sort of mental. We have an idea of someone who knows things. So you're saying it's an analogy, but normally when you have an analogy, you can sort of cash it out. So you think, wow, he's on fire. And then you say, what do you mean? Do we need to get the fire brigade? Well, he's not literally burning. I just mean he's sort of doing incredibly well. And okay, I see what you mean. So when you say God is all-knowing, and okay, you don't mean knowing in the way we know things, like propositional mental states. But what do you mean then? How do we cash out the analogy? There must be a reason you're setting up that analogy rather than just saying, you could just say, God is just completely ineffable, right? Completely, nothing we can say. This is, I suppose, the tradition of negative or apophatic theology, where we just cannot say, or at least we can't say anything positive. Maybe we can say negative things about God. God is not this and not that, not physical, not mental, not whatever you can think of. But you're in some sense saying positive things. So how do we cash out this analogy then that God is all-knowing if it's not knowing in the way we know things?
Right. So I hear maybe a couple of different concerns. So let me know if I'm correct in interpreting maybe some of those concerns. One concern, it seems like, originally what I was thinking you were going to say, was kind of almost like a Duns Scotus style objection, which is that
Should we tell people who Duns Scotus is?
Yes. So he's
a friend of yours.
Yeah, he's a friend of mine. We were just talking with him on social media before I came in.
Right.
No,
is he on X or is he just
that's
on
right. That's right.
Just on Instagram?
No, he's on what's the alternative? Blue Sky. There we go.
You got annoyed with the.
So Scotus was a scholastic theologian, philosopher, who's kind of seen as almost like an alternative oftentimes to St. Thomas Aquinas.
Okay, so when are we talking?
We're talking, 13th century, 14th century?
I don't know.
Yeah, somewhere around that time.
That's right. I put you on the spot.
Yeah.
A while ago.
Yeah, 13th, 14th century, somewhere around that time frame. Scotus he'll argue that that if you're really going to use analogies, you're going to need some sort of univocal predication in there somewhere, right? And so you can't make sense of analogical predication without there being some univocity, right?
Right, yes.
And so I was kind of interpreting a little bit of what you were saying in reference to that.
So maybe can we cash out those terms just in case they're a little bit technical? So univocity, I mean, there's something that's not analogous, that's in common, or
that's right.
Yeah.
That's
right.
right.
Okay. That makes sense.
And so when you're thinking like that, it seems like that might be a good rule to have when it comes to talking about comparing different objects. Like when you compare an object, say me with the tree back there, right?
Yeah.
You're comparing two objects. And if you're going to say that we have something in common, right? If you're going to say that Tyler's like a tree or the tree is like Tyler in some particular way, maybe you think there needs to be some univocity somewhere that grounds that analogical predication. But again, that's when we're talking about objects.
Right.
And when it comes to talking about God, God's not an object. And so that's maybe a good rule of thumb when comparing to objects, right? The analogical predication needs univocity somewhere, but it might not be the case in reference to that which is beyond objecthood, so to speak. And so that's kind of how one sort of worry that I was kind of sensing that you were saying in there. Another point is to say that when we're talking about apophatic theology, apophatic theologians can be split. So some will just say, only negative theology all the way down, right?
Right.
Others will say, well, no, I mean, there's no positive univocal predication that we can give, right? But nonetheless, we can at least give like analogies that are poor, right? To have some sort of positive language. And so that's more of the camp that I would fit in within, like, St. Thomas as well. Hopefully that kind of clears it up. But I guess kind of ending on that thought, I look at language kind of like theological language about God, as pointing us into the right direction. It gets our minds closer to truth, so to speak.
So might it be like, even though you can't, what I'm hearing from you, and tell me if this is right, even though we can't like kind of cash out the analogy, maybe it's sort of beyond our understanding, it still gets us on the right lines. I mean, I don't know, here's an analogy for you. Suppose I'm teaching my 5-year-old some kind of complex way things work, and it's too complicated, they're never going to understand. So I give them an analogy. I say it's like, when we share, it's a bit like sharing.
Yeah.
And so all they've got is the analogy, and they can't cash out the analogy, but still they've got some understanding through the analogy. Is it a little bit like that? So maybe we can't answer that question, what does God have that's like knowing? But still, in understanding that God is a little bit like an all-knowing being, we get some closer understanding. Is that getting close to?
So I have a 2-year-old. I have 7 kids, right?
Wow.
Big Catholic family. I've got 7 kids.
Impressed.
My
I thought it's hard enough with 2. How do you get anything done?
Yeah. Anyway. Awkward sleeping hours. No. My 2-year-old, her name's Evangeline, and she has no idea what Disney World is. In fact, she's living in Vietnam right now, and it's not like Disney or Disney World is like a big thing in her life. But let's all of a sudden say, hey, we're going to Disney World, right? She's gonna be like, okay, right? What's that? And if I was like, well, Disney World, it's like a Happy Meal,
right,
and a playground,
right.
She knows what Happy Meals are. She loves her Happy Meals, right?
Okay.
I'm not giving a positive description,
right,
so to speak, of Disney World. But yet, clearly the language that's being used is getting her to understand important truths that get her a closer, better understanding to reality and what Disney World is, even without a positive description. And so, or at least a positive univocal description. So anyway, so that's kind of how I see our language about God.
That was a much better analogy than the one I gave. Thank you very much. I'm glad it asked. So can this help with the problem of evil? Because I suppose we're thinking like, okay, if we've got this understanding, I know what all-knowing is, I know what an all-powerful being would be, I know what a good being would be, and from my positive understanding of those characteristics, a being that was all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly good, they wouldn't create a world like this with all this suffering. But maybe if God is completely other and doesn't have those human-style properties, maybe the clash disappears because we don't know enough about what God is to get the clash going between the existence of God and the suffering we find in the world. Is that?
Yeah, no, I think that's actually so. In fact, in my recent element on Eastern philosophy and classical theism,
So that's Cambridge Element. People, tell us what Cambridge Elements are.
Yeah, so Cambridge Elements are these cool small books that Cambridge University Press publishes, where it's on a particular topic, kind of gives you a little bit of an introduction to the topic, but also you argue for something kind of positive and novel. And so they're short.
Yeah.
So they're like, I don't know, 60 pages, 70 pages. And
so you've got one on...
So I've got one on Eastern philosophy and classical theism.
Right.
And in it, I make this very point about problem of evil, about contradictions within theism, trying to derive contradictions within God. That basically these sorts of objections get off the ground if we're assuming univocal predication. But if our language is all analogical and more dissimilarity than similarity and so on and so forth, then it's a lot of the force behind it does not actually move. I think the classical theists, rightly so. And so if you think that the problem of evil, you think, well, yeah, it's primarily understood like God's a person and he's good in the same way we are good, and he's got duties to us as his creation and so on and so forth. If you just kind of throw away all that, right?
We don't know what the hell God is.
then it's going to be a lot harder to come up with kind of here's a refutation.
I see. Yeah, I mean, I think this will appeal to people. I mean, it gets back to where we started the conversation, actually. It appeals to sort of spiritual but not religious people who I think don't like religion, but part of that, at least, not all of it necessarily, but part of it is this idea that, religions, the Abrahamic faiths have this very anthropomorphic idea of the old guy in the sky. And they'll say, I'm a spiritual person, but I believe in something. You often hear people say that, don't you? I believe in something. Maybe they'll say a higher power, but not the old guy in the sky. But it sounds from what you're saying, actually, that's pretty much what you believe, and the Catholic bloody Church believes in this God that is beyond understanding, that can be partially grasped in this analogical way, but ultimately is beyond understanding. And I like that. I mean, it resonates with me deeper than the big mind idea of God. I mean, I've been wondering actually, like, what is it that it feels to me very unspiritual, this idea that God is just like a big mind, a big conscious mind. And part of it, I think, is I think this does connect with what you've been saying. It doesn't seem to answer the riddle of existence. It comes back to sort of the old new atheist objection, right? Okay, you say, we need an explanation of why the universe exists. Well, there's this big mind that created it. Well, the next question is, well, where did that big mind come from? Who created that big mind? So if there's going to be something that solves the riddle of existence, something that there are no more questions, it just has to exist, that is going to be something radically other. That is going to be something beyond human understanding.
More fundamental than a mind, more not a composite, something simpler, so to speak, like the sheer act of existence itself. So I think that's right. And so as a Catholic, I also think that while this is true of the divine nature, that in some way, in some mysterious and beautiful way, the divine nature became man, right? In the person of Jesus Christ, who bore our sins on the cross and rose again for our justification. And so I think like there's good evidence to think that Jesus rose from the dead. You're familiar with all those sorts of stuff, with all those sorts of arguments. I don't need to get into that here, but the idea is kind of like the best of both worlds. It's like qua divine nature, you have this more fundamental kind of realist depiction of existence itself, while at the same time, right, our souls and needs can be met through the person of Jesus Christ.
I see. So God in God's nature is beyond comprehension, radically other, but then we've got this ultimate image of God in Christ, and that's, so you got the best of it. That's interesting. Okay, but so what you've just said is going to be something Buddhists disagree with.
Mm.
So let's come to, but you do want to say, insofar as we're talking about classical theism, you want to say many different religions share this belief in classical theism, even as you just said, worship of the god of classical theism. And well, this is what your Cambridge element that you've mentioned. We'll put a link in the notes to this video. So tell me a bit about that. So so Buddhists are classical theists, or a kind of Buddhist? Let's start with the Buddhists.
Yeah, so I understand Buddhism to, at least the kind of central metaphysical theses, to be something like impermanence, which is one main way to cash that out is to say that things don't retain identity from moment to moment. So all things are impermanent. And then all things are interdependent. All things ultimately, conceptually, and causally are dependent on other things. Right? And this kind of leads to this idea of emptiness, that there is nothing with like its own being, so to speak. That ultimately all things are empty of an intrinsic nature because they're all interconnected and impermanent.
Yeah.
Right? So that's how I understand the central metaphysics of Buddhism, at least largely understood. You might think that, well, how can you have an immutable, impassible God, right, with impermanence and interdependence? But actually, if you think that, if you read people like Jay Garfield and David Burton and Jan Westerhoff, the metaphysical theses of Buddhism apply to things, objects, phenomena. And again, if you think that God is totally other, so to speak, not doesn't fit into these categories, then you can consistently affirm these theses without necessarily implying that God is like this as well. And then you get into actually like the Pali Canon and the Buddhist scriptures, and you start seeing that there is an unconditioned realm, pure bliss. And the Dhammapada talks about this kind of radical, ineffable bliss reality called nirvana, nibbana, and it sounds very much like God, how I would conceive of God. And then you look at certain Buddhist traditions that emerge later on, say within Shin Buddhism and Pure Land Buddhism in Japan, or in Tibetan Buddhism, a very old tradition called Shintong tradition with Delpopa. And they believe, like Delpopa is like, yeah, there's this immutable, impassible reality. It's transcendent, it's immanent. He even calls it omniscient and omnipotent. He says it's not a thing, but it's like this a third other, so to speak. And he even says it's primordial awareness and the reason why we have consciousness, right? So, I mean, and you have similar stuff within Shinran. And so when you're talking about whether it be in the Pali Canon and describing nirvana as this kind of permanent, unconditioned bliss reality, or when it's talking about the Buddha nature that undergirds all reality, right? You definitely have Buddhist traditions that seem to, at least what the claim that I make in the element is not necessarily that they're theists or classical theists, but that the metaphysics that they endorse are at least consistent with the metaphysics endorsed by classical theism. So it's slightly more modest. But I do think that you can make a case that there is genuine convergence there.
That's fascinating. Is that all forms of Buddhism or some forms? So my understanding was there's maybe different schools of Buddhism, and some would say nirvana, and nirvana is just nothingness, it's just annihilation, just escape from the horrors of reality. But then you're saying for other schools of Buddhism, this blissful emptiness is in some sense a reality, although a radically other reality. So you're saying some forms of Buddhism are consistent with Theism? Or?
No, good qualification question. So in the Shintong tradition that I mentioned, which is a Tibetan tradition, early Tibetan tradition, it'll actually say that reality is empty of other, but is not actually empty of own being. So they're very, very firm on this. When it comes to certain traditions, yes, they're very explicit. There is permanent reality, or that which is beyond our reality, which is permanent, immutable, etc. Other traditions, when they read like the Dhammapada and stuff, and they see nirvana being talked about in a very positive way, they'll say, oh, maybe this is just like a skillful means. It's helping people want nirvana. It's helping them want to reach it, but really it's just complete extinction.
Okay.
Right? And so this actually becomes an exegetical argument. And I actually think that the better exegesis is on the side of those who think that nirvana is that which is positive bliss rather than complete emptiness or extinction.
Right. That's very interesting. But going back to the analogies, understanding God by analogy. So you, as a Catholic, think we understand God to some extent accurately through these analogies of being all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly good. So these Buddhists are going to deny that, right? They're not. They don't apply these personal predicates to nirvana, even analogically. So isn't that a difference? Is that a difference? That is a difference, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that you saying that doesn't necessarily impact what is actually believed at the metaphysical level, what is real. Is that
right?
The thought?
Well, so even in the example of Shinsan Buddhism, I mean, Del Popo will actually say, yeah. The Buddha nature is omniscient and omnipotent and so on. And then,
I stand corrected then.
And then in Shinran, in Shin Buddhism, he basically the Buddha nature is able to manifest itself in some way as to kind of like the meat of Buddha flows from that. And so you have like these personal qualities kind of manifesting from this kind of more kind of impersonal realm. And so I think, again, not saying they believe exactly the same thing, but if you're talking about the kind of generic metaphysics behind both views, the general metaphysics behind both views, I think that there is actually a lot of synergism and convergence and room for logical consistency.
That's so interesting. Well, I wonder how far we can take this. I mean, you mentioned earlier Advaita Vedanta, so that's the school of Hindu mysticism that's probably best known in the West. And actually, I was talking recently on the Panpsychist podcast that people want to check out with Miri al-Bahari, who's a very good analytic philosopher who works on Advaita Vedanta and defends a form of panpsychism in line with Advaita Vedanta. And she's doing something kind of similar to you in that she wants to say Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism are compatible. This is kind of controversial. She described it as a little bit heretical. But I mean, they seem to conflict. So Advaita Vedanta believes in this blissful, impersonal consciousness at the root of things that they call Brahman, this sort of pure consciousness. Buddhism doesn't seem to talk about that. But Miri's explanation of this is she thinks, well, that's because really what the Buddha was interested in was more pragmatic considerations, what's going to get people involved in spiritual practice. There's this famous story of someone asking the big questions of philosophy to the Buddha, where did the universe come from? Did someone create it? Has it always existed? And the Buddha says, you remind me of someone who's shot by an arrow. And then they ask, what's the arrow made of? How long is it? Where was it constructed? And just get the bloody arrow out. And I actually disagree with the Buddha on this. I think spiritual practice isn't the only important thing. Philosophy, trying to have our best guess at the ultimate nature of reality, that's a valuable and noble part of the human endeavor. But anyway, so disagree with you on that one, Buddha. But anyway, so she thinks really actually that's why the Buddha doesn't talk about these metaphysical things that fit more with Advaita Vedanta. But that doesn't mean it's incompatible. It's interesting actually what you talked about, a similar debate about pragmatics in Buddhism, but that might go in the opposite direction. But yeah, so turning to Advaita Vedanta, would you say there's a similar consistency there?
Yeah, so I do, I think so. But real quick, if I can go back to your point. Yeah, so if you read the discourses, right, the Buddha is actually really non-committal metaphysically speaking. Right. And so it's kind of like, actually, is he even denying the self? And so there are Buddhist proponents who go, maybe he's not even really denying the self. What he's doing here is he's not wanting them to believe that there is a self, because that's actually going to be more damaging to their enlightenment,
right.
whether or not there is a self or not.
I see.
And so you have that, and so, but yet as Buddhism develops as a tradition, you have more metaphysical views being articulated. And so the idea could be that, well, maybe the Buddha was either telling us that reality wasn't so metaphysical, then, because that would hurt our chances at enlightenment. But now we've kind of matured to where we can play with metaphysics a little bit more. We've being able to alleviate the pain. The Dharma wheel has turned one time, maybe even two times. Now we can kind of do more advanced metaphysics behind kind of the Buddhist philosophy. So anyway, just kind of to go to bat, to try to make the case for the Buddha. Here's kind of the most plausible case I think I can give for how to make that. With respect to Shankara, so sometimes people will say that one of the philosophers I've already mentioned, Del Popa, is basically like a secret Advaita Vedanta advocate, right?
Right.
He's quasi Vedanta.
Just on Shankara, in case people don't know, is I guess the key figure historically in Advaita Vedanta. I think that sort of has precedent in earlier Hindu scripture, but he's
the Upanishads.
The key figure. Go on, continue.
Yeah, and so you have this idea where Brahman you have different conventions of reality, right? So you have the conventional reality as we understand it, where there's objects and persons and that sort of thing, right? And then you have a higher degree of reality, right? A fundamentality, which is just God. But God is still understood through personal lenses. And then you have ultimate reality, the first layer of reality, the true noumenal level of reality, where you have this oftentimes articulated as impersonal, propertyless, kind of pure consciousness Brahman at ultimate reality. And so the idea is that we need to get our right realization about what's truly ultimate and fundamental here and not mistake the third level for the first, right?
Right.
And so it seems like there's a philosopher, really good Advaita scholar named Ramachan. And Ramachan is, he advocates that he thinks that there might be room for manyness to some degree, at some level of existence in Shankara, that it's not total, straight up, 100% monism, radical monism all the way down. And I think that's right. When as a Christian, when I'm thinking about kind of models for God, I like to look at creation kind of as a reflection or an echo of the sound, or a reflection of the object that's being observed in a mirror, right? And so creation is kind of this reflection, this echo, and in fact, this has a lot of grounding in certain scholastic philosophers like Saint Bonaventure, who literally will describe creation as like an echo and reflection and so forth. And so in the sense, it's not like when you're looking at an object and you see its reflection, you're like, oh, look, there are two objects here, right?
Right.
No.
Right, I see.
There's one. There's not two competing. And in fact, again, if we're understanding God is not an object, right, then of course there aren't two competing objects, right? But even if we're just looking at the analogy here, and we're saying, it's not exactly two, but maybe it's a qualified one, or maybe it's not exactly one as we would normally even understand it either. But it's not like there's two here. And so if that's what we're kind of getting at, if you say that Brahman is propertyless, well, I think God is metaphysically simple, so he doesn't have metaphysical parts.
Right.
So I think there's actually a lot of convergence here. And so if you say, well, Shankara, doesn't he think that God ultimately is just this utterly impersonal being? And where Shankara again is saying that that ultimately because God is without qualities, etc. I think it's hard to categorize what God really is like for Shankara. And if that's the case, then maybe we could say, similar as with the Christian theist, that there's in some sense in which God is impersonal, in other senses maybe that he has more personal qualities. And so it might be the case that the Advaita scholar will emphasize impersonal and the Christian personal, but I don't necessarily see there being conflict there. And this is something that Keith Ward does a really good job at bringing it out.
Right. Well, this kind of connects to something I wanted to ask you about. So I believe in God in some sense, but yes, in a couple of ways in which I've got a non-standard understanding of God. And one of those, well, I'd like to ask you whether this is non-standard, whether this is consistent or inconsistent with classical theism. So I'm inclined to think we overlap with God a little bit. And indeed, we overlap in our essential natures, and in God's essential natures. There's some kind of overlap. So there's something in the core of my being that is divine, that is a bit of God, and not just me. You too. Nothing special about me. So there's a bit of God at the core of me. It's not all of God, right? So there's more to God than that. So think about a Venn diagram. So there's a bit of God that's not me. There's a lot of me that's not God, but then there's a bit of overlap. There's something in my nature that overlaps with God's nature. And I mean, part of the reason, as people who listen to this will know, I recently quite a profound psychedelic experience using a powerful psychedelic known as 5-MeO-DMT, which I keep telling people not to do. It's absolutely terrifying. But in any case, what that experience seemed to reveal to me, and we can discuss it, was it a hallucination? People can watch my talk at Liverpool University on should we trust psychedelic experiences if they're interested on this channel. But in any case, if assuming it wasn't a hallucination, what this experience seemed to reveal to me is that there is something timeless, spaceless, uncreated at the core of my being. I have this metaphor. It was a little bit like, imagine my mind is a light bulb wrapped in cotton wool. And so the cotton wool is like kind of what's particular to me, Philip Goff, and you've got your cotton wool, and everyone's got but then there's this. The light bulb is sort of this pure, timeless, spaceless consciousness at the core of our being. And then what this experience was like the cotton wool getting torn off, and then there's just this pure consciousness shining through. But anyway, so I mean, and we might connect this to Advaita Vedanta, because they say not only Brahman is the fundamental thing, but I am Brahman. They have the word Atman, as I'm sure you know. It means the sort of the self or the soul. So Atman is Brahman. In the Christian tradition, we have Meister Eckhart, who said things like, the ground of the soul is the ground of God. Got in a bit of trouble with the Pope about that. But so these things that I'm saying that are somewhat resonant with Meister Eckhart or Advaita Vedanta, one would think that that doesn't fit with classical theism. It's too much of an intimate connection to God. It's denying in some sense the radical otherness of God. What do you think? Do you think there's a conflict there?
Yeah, so I think there potentially could be a conflict, but not necessarily. So
I might not be a heretic. Brilliant. Tell me more.
At least about that topic. There might be other topics.
There's something else. There's something else that I'm sure you know about. That's definitely not kosher. Anyway, go on.
Yeah, you're not a fan, for example, of the Premier League champions Arsenal. So I think that's right. So you've got some certain heretical views.
We're getting in trouble here with Nathan, who's filming this. But anyway, go on.
Yeah. So when
we're not allowed to talk about sport on this podcast. I've come from Liverpool, and whenever you say from Liverpool, people say, "Oh, what football team?" I was like, I've never actually been to a football match in my life. I like the Beatles. Just try and steer the conversation to the Beatles. Anyway, let's get back to God.
Yeah, so
an easier topic than football.
That's right. So when you're talking about there being this kind of reality that is radically immanent in all things, right? In fact, looking at certain early Native American religious traditions, you have this idea of Wakanda, which is this like something that's kind of like in all things, but at the same time it is not those things. It's transcendent but radically immanent, and they're trying to describe it. And I have a lot of sympathy with this kind of understanding. Same thing with the Buddha nature that undergirds all reality, or the ineffable Tao. And so, like, the heart of what you're trying to get at, I think, is right. And I think that's all the great traditions get at that same heart, get that same sort of place. That beneath us truly is God. But within the Catholic tradition, right, you have people like Saint Catherine of Siena, who says, like, there is a sense in which I am not, but only God is. And even you have people like in the Reformed tradition, like Jonathan Edwards, he'll say something very similar to that. And so I think that there is a real sense in which ultimately, fundamentally, right, beneath us is simply God. Now, do I think that we can parse that in such a way where, while it's true I'm participating in God, I am not God in some sense, but in some other sense we can say that, like, beneath me is just God? This is where it gets a little bit, you have to be careful how you word certain things. But I think ultimately what we're getting at is something that's the same.
That's interesting. Al-Ghazali in the Islamic tradition, trying to make sense of certain Sufi experiences, certain Sufi mystics said, I am the truth, or I am the real, which is a name for God in the Quran, and got brutally executed for this. And so Al-Ghazali was trying to make sense of this not being heretical, and he said, look, what's going on is it's just like when you're completely in love and your whole attention is on the beloved and you forget yourself, and so they're not really God, they're just wholly focused on God. You sort of saying something more than that? So you're sort of saying, in some sense, we can say all there is God, which gets very close to Brahman is Atman, Atman is Brahman. So at what point does it get heretical? At what point does it, no, that's too far, where's the line here? I was thinking the very specific thing, if I say in terms of our essential nature, me and God overlap, not just me. Is that okay to say?
So
if you're a Catholic, even?
I would put it like this. I would say I'm a pluralist about being, and about there being some sense in which degrees of existence.
Right.
And so God is sheer existence, right? If we were to degree this using anthropomorphic categories, I'd say he's a 10, right? Out of 10, right? We exist to some lesser degree.
9.
Maybe even less.
Okay.
And so when it comes to God, right, at the most fundamental layer of reality, it just is God. It is Brahman alone, right? Now, in the sense that existence itself can kind of depict a reflection or echo of itself, right? That's who we are. And that echo, that depiction, that reflection, it's not as real as a 10, but nonetheless, it's there. And you have to have some sort of accounting for a reflection or for an echo. Your ontology has to make some room for that. But within that, again, when you're talking about the echo, when you're talking about the reflection, you're not like, wow, these are two radically different things. Like the echo and the sound and the reflection and the object, right? Like you're not looking at that and you're saying this is two, right? You're like, no, like it's much more intimately connected with that. And so I would try to kind of go a little bit more of that route in talking about participatory metaphysics within God's nature to make sense of these sorts of claims.
So maybe I'm an echo of God. This is fascinating. I need to think more about this. So I was assuming this was just obviously inconsistent with Orthodox Christian belief, but maybe it's not. But let's come to my other non-standard view about God, which I think probably there's going to be more disagreement, is that God is not all-powerful. And I've been pressing this line as the best explanation of why there's so much bloody suffering, right? Because God's limited in power. God's made the best universe they can. And I use the they pronoun for God because, he's non-binary, obviously. Anyway, we don't need to worry about that. So what do you think about that? Well, what do you think about that as a solution to the problem of evil? And no, let's do it the other way. That's presumably inconsistent with classical theism?
Yes, right. Where that God is limited. Yeah, I would phrase it differently. So earlier, we talked about how with God, if he's so other, so to speak, if he is not a person like you and I are persons, then maybe we're not going to have the same motivation for thinking, well, then this person who's a moral agent just like us must not exist, right? Or he doesn't predict the sort of evil that we have in the world. So I would probably go that route, with a scholastic understanding that evil's a privation, a lack of being, a lack of existence. God is existence itself and is not obligated, is not a person, to create more being than what's already, funnel more being than what's already funneled, so to speak. And so kind of putting this more in line with kind of something adjacent to skeptical theism. So my son named Elijah, he is now about to be 12, actually in a couple weeks. But when he was about 2 or 3 years old, I came home from work, and I just got in my first, I'm in my first, tenure track position. I just had graduated with my PhD in philosophy. Exciting times. Life was really good. It was in my own hometown in Houston. And I come home expecting to be, on one of my first days of work, expecting to be greeted by all my family and kissed and loved. And then all of a sudden, I realize no one's greeting me, and then I hear screaming. And I'm like, oh, what's going on? So I rushed to the back of the house, and my son, he was kind of gliding on a swing, like an outside swing, like not a child swing, but like an adult swing that you would kind of sit and rock back and forth on. And my wife, being a good mom, was like, hey, Elijah, you're going to get hurt. Get down. And Elijah, being a good boy, he gets down. But he doesn't get down by sitting down and then getting off. He gets down by jumping off. And when he jumps off, his arm, according to my wife, got stuck on a nail.
Oh, Jesus
and he was hanging
Christ.
by the nail.
Oh, God,
right?
I'm so sorry.
And so I take him to the hospital. We rush him. I put him down at the table. And they're telling me, basically they don't have much time to do a lot of stuff. So they just start poking and prodding. They have me pin him down. And he was just looking at me like, Daddy, can't understand what in the world, why I'm letting them do a whole bunch of needles and sharp objects into his arm right now.
God.
And all I kept telling him was I love you, I love you, I love you, and reassuring him that I love him as they were doing this. And it's like, if my 2-year-old, 3-year-old son there is more like me right now than I am like God, then what makes me think I'm going to be in a position to kind of guess what existence itself would do in some given instance, right? Especially as it pertains to evil and privation and creating more existence than already exists and that sort of thing. So I think that's kind of my more preferred way of talking about evil is God's not a moral agent like you and I are. He's not a person. Evil's privation. And then ultimately, if God is so radically other, we're not really in the position to judge, right, what God would likely do or not do given some instance of non-existence.
I'm a bit taken back by that story. I think is Elijah okay now?
He is. No, he's. We just built him a computer for his 12-year-old birthday, and he's gaming like crazy. So
okay, so well, I guess what you give me is your explanation of suffering, and we could have a debate about that, and maybe we will. But let's just focus on incompatibility with classical theism.
Yes.
And is my view definitely incompatible with classical theism? Because if we're in this business of it's all analogy, it's all analogous. Maybe I just say, well, the better analogy for God, this ineffable, unknowable thing, is a person who's not all powerful, a person who has limited power. Why can't that work?
See. Yeah. So
just thought of that now.
Yeah. So the idea here is well, when I say God's all powerful, right? I mean, you could mean, right, and you give me some sort of analytic, jointly necessary and sufficient account of what it means to be all powerful, right? And then on your view, you're like, well, no, I don't think that God is all powerful in that sense. But what you could mean is when you say God is all powerful, I don't mean this kind of jointly necessary and sufficient account of a power that's all nice and parsed out. I just mean that his ability to do X, right, is unlimited, or maybe you wouldn't even say that. Maybe you would just say something like, I just mean that this account that we're giving here, it's kind of like that, right? I'm not saying it's that, but it's kind of like that. And so because it's kind of like that, I can still say God is all powerful. So here's kind of a creative retelling of your story, is that from your perspective, maybe you can be both a non-classical theist and classical theist in the sense that you're denying standard accounts of omniscience, omnipotence, or omnibenevolence, or what have you. But at the same time, you're saying that these are also true in an analogical sense. And so you have kind of a God who's kind of limited in the sense that, he doesn't fit these unlimited accounts, but, nonetheless kind of classical and unlimited in the sense that, you're still agreeing with technically the propositions behind these accounts. It's just you're understanding them analogically. Does that make any sense?
I think so. I mean, if it's insofar as God is just completely beyond comprehension, beyond all our categories, wholly other, yeah, fine. But insofar as we get a good grip on God through analogy, I'm going to say the correct analogy is limited power, not all power. All powerful, limited power. I mean, if it's just an analogy anyway.
Right.
Why not? Why can't that be the better? And insofar, just to press the problem of evil itself, I mean, insofar as you're trying to evade it by saying, well, these are only analogies, God is completely other. But insofar as we understand something of God with these predicates.
Right.
So insofar as thinking of God as perfectly good and all-powerful gives me some understanding, it clashes with suffering. It feels problematic. So why not turn to an analogy that fits better with suffering, and so seems to be more plausibly accurate? Okay, it's still just an analogy, but seems to be more plausibly accurate. And it's not like, you going back to your explanation of suffering, it's not like that there's nothing to that, but I still find it leaves you somewhat unsatisfied. Wouldn't it be better to have some more of an explanation, and go for an explanation if you got one? And this does seem to me to do the job of giving an explanation. So why not? Why not be a classical theist who doesn't believe in an all-powerful God?
Yeah.
Thinks the correct analogy is limited God.
Right. So you might say, well, there's some sense in which the analogies that the classical theist is giving are apt. They're just not as apt as some of these other analogies, right? And so you might go that route, but then I guess it would kind of turn into maybe a natural theology debate about whether or not whether or not there's good evidence that one analogy is more apt than the other, or something like that. And then, which on my side, I would say, but remember, right? You're still looking at God as fundamentally a person like you and I when you're wondering why all this evil in the world. And so if you have my framework, then it sort of doesn't get off the ground. And so then we can kind of debate about whether or not the frameworks are better or not. But I think ultimately that's going to turn to kind of pure reason, a debate on natural theology.
Right. Okay, well, you give me lots to think about, and I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm gonna take it away and find out whether or not I'm a heretic. And so where I land religiously is I was raised Catholic actually, but I moved to the Anglican Church because I think in practice you can be a little bit more free thinking, sure. You can be more open, and I feel a bit more comfortable with that. And I think I'm still a bit too much of a heretic for that. It's probably more ethical reasons actually that would be my concern there. But well, as we tie things up, is there anything you'd like to share about yourself, Tyler, or how people can learn about your stuff? We've talked about the Elements book, or what you're thinking about, or what would you like to say?
You feel free to find me on Twitter. Tyler McNabb is, I think, my handle. Maybe Tyler D. McNabb. But I'm in that cesspool along with you and some others who are sticking it out for the philosophy itself or something like that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I primarily publish in philosophy, religion, comparative philosophy, especially with Eastern philosophical traditions, and then religious epistemology. That's actually originally what
Yeah.
I was primarily doing. So, but no, it's been a pleasure talking with you and getting to meet you. And thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks, Tyler. It's been a really fun conversation. Let's carry it on.